Welcome to Invalides Asia Weekly Roundup. In today's program, we will have a special focus on the issue of disappearances in Asia, details on the new anti-torture law in Bangladesh, release of this year's Global Gender Gap Report, and what it means for Asia. Nepal is heading for fresh elections. Executions of Baloch nationals in Iran. Stay with us for more on these issues. Welcome to Invalides Asia Weekly Roundup. I am Ansar Stianes. In our special report on disappearances in Asia, we start in Sri Lanka, where a commemoration of the tens of thousands of disappeared persons was held on October 27 at the monument to the disappeared at Radilua, Sidua. Commemorations have been held here for the last 23 years, where the remains of 2 persons were found. At this year's event, family members of the disappeared persons from the north and south of Sri Lanka gathered. The opening speech was delivered by Era Wickramaratne, a member of the parliament, who said that all the governments which have so far ruled Sri Lanka are responsible for the tears that the family members of the disappeared are shedding even today. Even this year, there have been reports of 56 disappearances. One mother of a disappeared son said that she knew it was the military who took her son. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Dr. Nevi Pillay, recently met many families of the disappeared during her visit to Sri Lanka. She and many other international and local human rights organizations have been demanding inquiries into the thousands of disappearances. So far, the government has taken no credible action to respond to these demands. Earlier, we spoke to AHRC's Basil Fernando, who has campaigned on the issue of disappearances for many years.
Why have there been so many disappearances in Sri Lanka?
When the government authorizes killings after arrest, naturally that is going to be having very large numbers. That is what happened in 1971, and in the south between 1987 to 1991, and also in the north throughout this whole period which is called the war. So that is why there is very large numbers.
Why is the government failing into the investigation?
When you authorize killings, you cannot also investigate the same people. So there is a policy of impunity. Government on the one hand will have a problem with the soldiers and the police if they are investigated now. Secondly, they may get into trouble because they can also be investigated. See, under the 1987 to 1991, it was a whole government program. So everybody who was in the cabinet of that government, they were accomplices of that. That is why there is a lot of fear of investigation. Because they are afraid that this is a war crime. Large scale disappearances is a war crime. So they could easily be prosecuted in even an international court.
How serious is the issues of disappearances around the rest of Asia?
It's very serious. And in all these places there are following common things. That there is no credible mechanism of any sort to take complaints and to investigate. There is no prosecution, and there is a blanket immunity. And the governments in Philippines, the government has signed the Convention Against Disappearances and made a law, but it's not implemented. Other countries, they don't even make law. They don't even sign the convention and don't make the law, because tacitly there is some kind of a belief, if we are in trouble, we will allow even killing of people after arrest and disappearances.
In the last decade, Pakistan has had amongst the highest number of forced disappearances in the world, especially in remote areas affected by armed conflict, such as Balochistan, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa or KPK province, Sindh province, and Pakistani-held Kashmir. Disappearances in Pakistan started around 2002 when military action in Balochistan increased after the 9/11. In Balochistan, disappearances are often associated with torture in custody and extrajudicial killings. Local groups claim that more than 8,000 persons are missing after their arrest by the state intelligence agencies. In KPK province, more than 1,000 persons are missing who were suspected members of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Similarly, more than 600 activists of nationalist groups are missing in Sindh province after being arrested by law enforcement agencies. In Pakistan-held Kashmir, nationalists who are struggling for independence are also frequently disappeared. Today, there are hundreds of missing persons complaints before the higher courts, many of them concerning abductions by state intelligence agencies. However, military and intelligence agencies are ignoring court orders and judicial probes to produce disappeared persons or explain their disappearances. In Bangladesh, enforced disappearances have been increasing alarmingly in recent years. Since January 2009, more than 80 people disappeared, according to documentation made by human rights defenders based in the country. Most of the allegations of these disappearances point to the law enforcement agencies and paramilitary forces. The authorities are constantly denying the involvement of state agents, and up to now, no records are available regarding any judicial remedy to the families of the disappeared. In India, the practice of enforced and involuntary disappearance is endemic in armed conflict areas like Chhattisgarh, Jammu and Kashmir, Punjab, and the northeastern states. Implementation of repressive laws like the Armed Forces Special Powers Act and Public Safety Acts worsen the situation as gives impunity to the armed forces. In Indonesia, enforced disappearances have been practiced since the New Order regime under the former President General Suharto, and it has continued after the reform period following the general's resignation in 1998. Several infamous cases of enforced disappearances in the country include the disappearances of over 30,000 individuals suspected to be communists during 1965 until 1968, the abduction of activists by military officers in 1997 until 1998, and the disappearances of Aristoteles Masoka, who was the key witness of the murder of Teis Eluai, a prominent Papuan leader. In all these cases, the perpetrators remain unpunished, and the whereabouts of those who were disappeared are still unknown. In the Philippines, it took 25 years after the end of Marcos' dictatorship for the government to outlaw enforced disappearance. In December last year, President Benigno Aquino III signed into law the Anti-Enforced Disappearance Act of 2012, making Philippines the first country in Asia to criminalize enforced disappearance. However, neither before nor after the enactment of this law have the families of victims of enforced disappearances obtained any kind of justice. In fact, in October 2012, some relatives of disappeared victims seeking remedies were themselves being abducted, detained, and prosecuted for criminal acts. Even though many perpetrators have been identified, they have yet to be arrested. And now over to Bangladesh. Last week, the Bangladesh Parliament enacted the Torture and Custodial Death Prohibition Bill, a bill drafted by the AHRC 5 years previously. For more on this watershed legislation, we have AHRC's Mr. Ashrafuzzaman in the studio. Welcome, Mr. Ashrafuzzaman.
Thank you.
Can you please explain to us about the passing of this law?
This law actually, it is part of the struggle of the Bangladeshi people, including millions of victims of torture in the country and the families of the extrajudicial killings in last several decades, and human rights defenders, civil society organizations. And AHRC had the responsibility to draft it on behalf of Mr. Saber Hossain Chowdhury, who tabled this bill in the parliament. And we had to take the responsibility of initiating campaign inside Bangladesh, lobbying inside Bangladesh, and also in the international community, explaining the importance of this law.
And what do you expect to change in Bangladesh after the enactment of this law?
I expect the first thing is that the nation should get the real benefit of criminalization of torture and custodial death. And for that, Bangladesh must understand and accept that impunity and rule of law cannot coexist together. The country which has the culture of impunity for years, and at the same time the judicial institutions, the criminal justice system, the investigation mechanism, it is not credible, and all these institutions are extremely weak. They need reforms, very thorough reforms. So if the nation wants to administer justice to the people of this country, they need to start with reforming their policing system, they need to reform their prosecutorial system, their criminal investigation system, because everything depends on torture.
In Nepal, the Supreme Court finally ruled on September 23rd that political leaders who have been convicted of a crime will not be allowed to stand for the November Constituent Assembly elections. The AHRC has said it welcomes that decision, which carries heavy symbolic weight and is a clear stance that human rights violations and crimes will not remain without consequences in a democracy. However, as human rights activists have repeatedly pointed out, a large majority of human rights violations committed during the conflict have not been brought before the courts because of vast obstacles faced by victims in accessing justice and political obstruction to investigation and prosecutions. Indeed, the AHRC is informed that politicians with criminal convictions, including for murder and disappearances, are already standing for election. The 2013 edition of the Global Gender Gap Report was released on October 24th. Founder and co-author Saadia Zahidi said of the report, "We are trying to understand how countries are empowering women economically, politically, access to health, and equal access to education. Regardless of how rich or poor the country is, we are trying to understand how equitably they are distributing wealth and opportunities between women and men." First launched in 2006 by the World Economic Forum, the index has for this year confirmed Pakistan as one of the worst performing countries in the world in terms of gender gap and inequality. Other Asian countries which were badly placed are Nepal, South Korea, Cambodia, India, and Indonesia. Iceland leads the index for the 5th consecutive year, followed by the 3 Scandinavian countries, confirming that Nordic countries equally value the talents of both men and women. The AHRC says it is easy to see the strong correlation between gender equality, access to education, entry into the job market, inclusiveness, and international competitiveness in the long term. Within the Asian scenario, it is important to appreciate the very good performance of the Philippines, which ranks 5th and much before many other developed countries. 16 Baloch political prisoners were executed in Iran in an act of revenge for an attack on the border security forces. In this encounter, according to government news agencies, 17 border security personnel were killed. The executed Balochis were already in Zahedan prison and took no part in the attack. The AHRC says the Balochis residing in Pakistan and Iran are victims of the regimes on both sides of the border, who are happy to use them as scapegoats to appease the public. They face enforced disappearances and extrajudicial killings in both countries. The second regional conference of Asian parliamentarians and human rights defenders on elimination of custodial torture and ill treatment in Asia will take place in Hong Kong on November 11 until 13. That is all for this week's Human Rights Asia Weekly Roundup. For more information on these issues, log on to www.humanrights.asia. Thank you for joining us and hope to see you again next week.